All right, everybody, if you can please take your seats, we will begin right now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Angel. I'm a senior at FIU pursuing my bachelor's degree in political science, and I'm an intelligence fellow at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy's ICCAE program under the Intelligence Analysis track. My research for the fellowship focused on MS-13 and their involvement in sex trafficking. The next panel will discuss economic security and national security. This is especially important in understanding US, Latin America, and the Caribbean relations because economic security is the foundation of national security. Instability in the region may fuel migration, transnational crime, and political unrest, all of which cause implications for the United States' national security amidst US-China strategic competition. It is my pleasure today to introduce our panelists, Gerard Johnson, Senior Advisor to the Caribbean and Small Enterprise Assistance Funds, Martín Retrao, former Central Bank President in Argentina and FIU visiting professor, Sylvia Cesarato, Consul General to the Canadian Consulate of Miami. This plenary session will be moderated by Aranza Loizaga, network news anchor at NBC's Universal Telemundo. Thank you and enjoy the panel.
Yes.
Good morning. Oh, yes, we have people that are awake right here. Thank you for answering. How's everybody today?
Cold.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much for being part of this fantastic conversation we're about to have. And let's just start with questions. Are you ready?
Shoot.
Fantastic. This is for all of you. We'll have about 2-3 minutes to answer so we can keep it, flowing. So economic security is not just about growth, it's about resilience. What's one concrete measure your country or organization is taking to build economic resilience against external shocks? Gerard.
Oh, thank you. As they say in cricket, the opening batsman. So I'm currently working for a private equity, impact private equity fund. Previously, I was at the Inter-American Development Bank. Specifically, what we're working on in the equity fund is the transition to solar. And that really matters because of the vulnerability of the Caribbean. And this is a fund just for the English-speaking Caribbean, although we have also included the Dominican Republic. It really matters because of the huge amount of foreign exchange that is used to pay for imported energy, hydrocarbons, and the very, very high cost of energy. I think in the US it's 9 cents a kilowatt hour. In the Caribbean it's between, well, several countries it's above 30 cents, sometimes 35 cents. So that also, the creation of jobs, a big problem in the Caribbean is the brain drain. The lack of opportunities makes it natural for people who are trained to want to leave, often to the North America, United States, and Canada. The other thing, of course, is the high debt. So the investments we make, one of the key requirements is that taxes be paid. If the governments don't bring down the debt, then as you've noticed, the availability of foreign assistance is falling, not rising. So homegrown solutions are paramount, and the government has got to balance its books. It's got to be able to find its way forward without looking outside.
But they're looking outside, for instance, with the presence of China and their investments in the Caribbean?
Oh, no, definitely. Well, as I say, I worked for 3 decades at the Inter-American Development Bank. A competitor in financing infrastructure, development infrastructure, is bilateral programs. And the most important bilateral program recently is from China. And so you talk about roads, places like the World Bank, IDB especially, were very active in financing infrastructure. And that the preference has been to shift that financing to China. But I think it's very important to be clear about something. There isn't a shortage of finance. It's a competition on finance. In other words, the governments are doing the same projects, or well, I should say they're doing more projects now because the availability of finance from China is much easier and more attractive in terms of for the governments.
Martin.
Well, during this last year here as working at FIU and also in my private financial capacity, I have been trying to basically pinpoint what are the common interests between the United States and Latin America moving forward, and particularly the threat to national security in the United States that the Chinese involvement in our region has meant, and basically the challenges moving forward. There's been a sort of securitization or weaponization of the agenda of the United States and Latin America in particular, when we look at issues that go beyond the traditional immigration, drug trafficking, illicit transfer of people around the region, but basically to move to areas like where China has made deep already inroads in Latin America in particular. I can mention three. One is trade, the other is investment, infrastructure, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the third that is less sort of perceived is the dual use of infrastructure. As we mentioned before in our private conversation before coming in, the increasing presence of ports that have on one part a commercial sort of approach, but in a case of a conflict between China and the United States, this could be used for military or logistics purposes. And that is the case of the port of Chancay in Peru, which has been recently inaugurated by President Xi Jinping in the summit of APEC at the end of last year. And also the possibility in the southern tip of the southern cone of our continent in Ushuaia, in Tierra del Fuego, I mean, basically in my country, in Argentina, the possibility of China building a commercial port with different uses. So my key take is that we should look at where are the common interests between the US and Latin America. And I can mention, just for my first sort of introduction to the subject, that there are a few that where our interests coincide. One is critical minerals, okay, where you have this sort of golden triangle, but also goes beyond also to Brazil, but the golden triangle, and I will say now basically between Chile and Argentina, in case of lithium and in case of copper, where so far a critical element is that Chinese investment in our region has been mainly extractive. So it has not left value added, it has not created employment for our local population. So the key challenge that when I look at the US Latin American agenda is how to coincide the interest of national security or the threats of national security, the agenda that the US has, with the needs of development that our region has. So when you look at, for example, critical minerals, I would like to see our countries doing or establishing a investment protection agreements in order to basically have US involvement, US companies having better involvement in terms of having the security that they need, the rule of law, but also in the key advantage that you could provide is moving along the value-added chain. Okay, for example, instead of basically doing lithium carbonate, basically moving along to build batteries. Batteries not for cars. We don't have the scale to do for cars, but yes, for still batteries, for houses, for factories. That's where there is an advantage there. So establishing bilateral agreements, now that the world has moved out from multilateralism, and that now that we have a different world where we have a more transaction diplomacy, no? I see that there is more room, and I would like either, you know, the famous phrase, you need two to tango, the US and Latin America taking positions in this area. The other is infrastructure, and basically not only infrastructure in physical infrastructure, but in digital infrastructure, and in particular in cybersecurity. When you see the possibilities of conflict between China and the US moving forward, although today we have good reasons to be more optimistic about basically what you have is a deal maker as a president, and he goes for the maximum, and then he settles for what is best for the United States, and I think he's getting through, and it's clearer now his agenda moving forward, but clearly in the area of infrastructure, what you need is a compelling alternative, okay? I sometimes say that when you get together with an American secretary or member of the cabinet, what you get typically is an advice. When you get together with a Chinese official, what you get is a port, what you get is a road, what you get is an airport. So clearly the issue is, how do we bring a balance there? I have some suggestions, I can make it now, but I have to like to pinpoint also on two other key areas, and then I leave it for a second round, where I see the agenda, because I like to provide solutions, basically, or how I see solutions. The other area is nuclear energy. Clearly, there is an advantage in our regions to produce small nuclear reactors. And what I see is that there is a precedent that Trump 45 has started in Romania. In Romania, the administration was able to remove Chinese influence in Romania and to develop basically a nuclear power plant of around $4 billion, and also a project that is underway at this point to develop small nuclear reactors. What you could have that project is being also widespread to Latin America, in particular where you have in Mexico, in Argentina, and I believe both countries have already developed quite some leeways in terms of the scientific capacity to produce nuclear technology. Last but not least is supply chains. What you have is that the US has a critical need to move supply chains from places that have been really tested in difficult times, like in pandemia, and have not been able to be reliable. So clearly in the area of telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, automotive, biotech, and particularly in the area, the whole technological sort of value-added chain, when we talk about critical minerals, also in the area in the southern cone, in particular in the Golden Triangle, you also have rare earth. And rare earth, as you know, is critical for technology, to build satellites, to build drones, to build the screens of our iPhones, of our notebooks. So those three areas, I will say. And last but not least is more a geopolitical, which is maritime presence. There is a strong depredation of the South Atlantic by Chinese and by other fishing companies. So the protection of the Atlantic, of the South Atlantic, There are also some common interests to develop in the area of defense, in the area of our army, and last but not least is Antarctica. As you are aware, China has also, since the last couple of decades, also declared as an Antarctic power, and they have reached a memorandum of understanding, in particular, for example, with Chile. So they are using the port of Puerto Arenas in order to have some influence on Antarctica. So the collection of scientific projects between Latin America, and particularly the countries that have been signatories of the Antarctic Treaty originally in 1957, which the US has been, which Argentina has been, and most of the Latin American countries, developing Antarctica there, because China sees also the capacity to look for minerals in order to feed their industries. And so again, the difference that the US can make is bringing the component of development with these areas, like I mentioned, critical minerals, rare earth, infrastructure, nuclear capacity, and the maritime influence in the Atlantic and Antarctica.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martin. Sylvia.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Good morning. Firstly, I'd like to thank the principals behind the conference for inviting me again this year to be part of this discussion. Canada is, of course, a country of the hemisphere, and we like to engage on the issues impacting the hemisphere. I want to start with maybe the beginning of your question, which was, how are you introducing resilience in your economy to deal with external shocks? So let me repeat, I'm from Canada. The first country that was perhaps targeted, along with Mexico, to some important external shocks. And what we've done is really a multi-pronged approach to introduce resilience in our economy. And I'll start there, and then I do want to talk about our own observations around China's growing presence in LAC and how we're addressing those. You know, Canada is the biggest customer for the US. We buy more from the US than China, Japan, UK, and France combined. We are the top customer for 35 US states. But the US is also an important market for Canada. Over 75% of our exports are destined for the US. So the prospect of tariffs was a very big external shock. And one of the things we immediately did was to announce retaliatory tariffs that were measured and very strategic in certain areas of the economy where Canada had an outsized position. We also addressing internal barriers to trade. It's no secret that we're a very big country, and it's easier to trade north-south than east-west, given the distance that we have from coast to coast. Over 5,500 miles, which is actually also the length of the border that we co-manage with the US. We're also very, very focused on diversifying our market. We are fortunate to have free trade agreements actually with the EU. I'll talk about it later, but with 7 countries in Latin America. We're part of CPTPP. And so we haven't taken advantage of those agreements enough to kind of do more and diversify our trade. We're, of course, looking forward to engaging with the Trump administration 2.0. Some of you may know that our new prime minister was in Washington last week, Monday or Tuesday, where they kind of reset the relationship and talked about what do we want to achieve together, in particular in the area of economic competitiveness for our 2 countries, but also, of course, for the hemisphere. And last but not least, we've also made money available to those companies that are most impacted by the tariffs. But the fact remains that 99% of our trade is tariff-free under the USMCA, and that is a carve-out for tariffs. And so, all in all, it's a very, very good story. In terms of some of the trends that we're seeing in Latin America, obviously we are a country of the hemisphere, and after the US, I think we're the country that's most engaged in Latin America and the Caribbean. True, as others have said, China's entry points are varied: trade, loans, roads, brick and road initiative, but also debt. They own a lot of debt in Latin America. We know that they're less stringent on environment and labor standards, which is also something that we're wary of. I think what we're seeing in LAC is that countries of Latin America are engaging with China in a very big way, as was noted. Also at the political level, there have been a lot of bilateral and high-level visits between Xi Jinping and leaders of the region. And that countries in the region don't want to choose between the US and China. They sense, of course, this tension between the US and China, and both are present in the region, and countries of the region want both countries to be present and engaged. They don't want to be getting in the middle of that tension. China has been working assiduously or stringently over the past few years to improve its image in the region. And that mostly began more recently during the pandemic, because they were one of the first countries to offer vaccines. So through that vaccine diplomacy, when maybe Canada and the US weren't as forward-leaning in the early days. They're engaging on culture. They're very active on social media. They're providing media training for journalists of the region. They're also not vocal like Canada and the US, and maybe others are, on what we see as human rights abuses or backsliding of democracy. Of course, they don't comment on that. What we've seen in Canada, and something I would caution against in the region, is undue influence and pressure via their diaspora communities. So in Canada, the Chinese government is very active within our university campuses, pressuring students to denounce other students if they speak ill of China. They're doing a lot of using our social media and online platforms to discredit politicians, so getting involved in our politics. And I think that's a risk for the region. Are they doing the same? The other is, I've lost my train of thought, maybe also involved in political campaign financing, which we have noticed also in South America and Latin America. One thing that we've developed in Canada, and I hope I'm able to talk about it, is a China exposure index, where we weigh a lot of these factors: the trade, the foreign direct investment, Belt and Road Initiative, number of companies, et cetera. And there are some companies that are very highly exposed to China, of course, those that we know intuitively, like Venezuela, but maybe others that we don't talk enough about, like Jamaica, Guyana, Dominica, Bahamas, Ecuador, and Peru. I think we've already touched on. Canada has a 3C engagement approach with China. We compete, we challenge, and where we can, we cooperate. So we talked about, or you mentioned a lot about the extractives. Canada is a big player in LAC in the extractive industries. Over half of our mining assets of Canadian companies are in the LAC region. I think that, I can't remember the amount that is, maybe 10, I can't remember the amount, but billions of dollars. And that's where we compete with China. It's an unfair competition because we adhere to much more stringent environmental requirements, labor standards, and to the point being made, we also contribute to the local economy. We don't fly in Canadian workers to work the mines like many Chinese corporations do. We're there to be present and contribute to the local economy. We also challenge China, and in particular on environment and labor standards, but on their respect for human rights and for democracy. And we cooperate with China, in particular in the environmental space, because that's where we feel they're very foreign-leaning and constructive in addressing the impacts of climate change. Maybe I'll leave it there because you'll have a question perhaps later on how present Canada is in the region.
Most definitely. Thank you. Gerard, are you concerned about the fact that in the Caribbean, there have been increasing their presence, China specifically, when it comes to collection data sites, intelligence collection. I heard that Leland Lazarus, who is somewhere here, mentioned during a hearing at Congress that they're using the 21st century spy book, China. They have been able to collect a lot of information of the growing presence in Cuba. And of course, we know that in Antigua, they also have a collection, intelligence collection site. What are the concerns for our hemisphere when it comes to national security?
Well, if you permit me to answer with reference to the Caribbean.
Of course.
I think I would be outside my competence to speak for the hemisphere. I think what you're pointing to is incredibly important. Unlike previous initiatives that were financial in nature, like Petrocarib, those things come and go. They are transient as long as the money is there. But I think what you're pointing to is the legacy aspects of the Chinese engagement in the region, which go beyond the current offerings of financing. What you're noticing, as I say, in the very limited geographical area I'm referring to, which is the English-speaking Caribbean, is a trend to using other sources of finance to contract Chinese EPC contractors. And what comes with it is the technology, I think, that you're referring to, that is, it turns out that even bridges, even hard infrastructure offers an opportunity to gather data on an ongoing basis. So I think it's important to look beyond the current financial arrangements, which already have morphed significantly in the last 5 years, to a reliance. Look at Guyana, or many other in Jamaica, where the Chinese technology and contractors are able to win contracts without financing. I think that's a very important transition.
Right. Are you worried about this situation in Latin America, the fact that the Chinese are increasing their intelligence collection sites all over? We spoke about that, like spatial site, esa cuestión espacial in Argentina. What are the main concerns?
Well, clearly the main concerns are in the threats that we have to national security in the region, but also how to balance that with the needs of development that our country has. So that is a very sort of difficult balance. At this point, as you are aware, our government has a direct alignment with the United States that has focused mainly in the financial problems that Argentina has, that has been so far relying on the International Monetary Fund and also on financing from China, in particular in swaps to the central bank that has been allowing more dependence from goods from China. So the critical element is that I'm speaking about countries like Argentina, Brazil, I would say mostly South America, is how to tackle that need for development and bringing people out of poverty.
Martina, if I may, if I recall correctly, President Milei said that he would never speak to a communist president. And he's speaking to Xi Jinping, and they're actually signing, agreements. And so what changed?
Well, they're not signing agreement, and the change is the weight of trade. In the case of South America, China is the first trading partner and that is the case of Brazil too. So clearly the issue is that we should move not only from trade, as I said in the previous intervention, in your previous question, the key challenge is how do we move now that the US is looking for reliable suppliers what reliable suppliers there could be in the region, not only for, I would say that in particular South America has three critical elements to offer to the United States and also to the rest of the world. One is energy security, in particular as you look at the development of artificial intelligence and the development of data centers around the region. Clearly the capacity that our region has to provide energy, as you know, AI data centers are heavily users of energy. So when you look at the development of these industries, what you need is where are the sources of energy? Those sources are particularly in South America. You have, in the case of Argentina, one, again, blessed by natural resources, what is called Vaca Muerta, which is the second largest reservoir of shale gas in the world and the fourth largest reservoir of shale oil around the world. And Argentina has been doubling its production of oil in the region. If you look at 2030, together Mexico, Guyana, Brazil, and Argentina will be providing as much as the Middle East in terms of oil and energy moving forward. Of course, what you need in the case of oil, it's easier. In the case of natural gas, you need further infrastructure, and therefore a critical element is there. So how do we balance those two factors? I would say that in terms of trade, it's more difficult that the US could replace China in the near future, but yes, in the development or in the focusing of where are the new value-added chain, the concept of near-shoring or friend-shoring or allied shoring. There's been a good research by the Inter-American Development Bank showing that the region, with Mexico included, could increase its exports to the United States in the next 10 years by 78 billion in looking to replace. But in areas like I mentioned before, automotive, biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and obviously in the area of technology. Clearly what you have in terms of the capacity to program that the wealth of human capital that we have in the region, and also the cost of human capital relatively less expensive than in the United States, could help really re-engage or have a closer supply chain between in these industries. Of course, the key element is moving forward, how do we move from trade, because the two legs are trade and investment, no? And the key issue is for Latin America to provide the institutions, the rule of law, the macroeconomic stability in order to give confidence to US institutions, but also to work together in developing that confidence. So,
talking about that confidence, for instance, how do you think that with this administration, the America First policy and those unilateral tariffs to Latin American countries are impacting the trust and the relationship between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States? Because the main focus of these tariffs is to bring everything back to the United States, correct? And so,
well, if you read correctly, is bringing it back to America.
Okay.
I have. Basically, I'm sure that all the audience have read a book by Karl Rove, Why the 1896 Election Matter, and that is the election of President William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, and its vision of the region of the Americas, of sort of reshaping the Monroe Doctrine again, and it has had an influence again in President Trump, in how he views the region. So I will say that it's America first, and then the Americas second, okay? So what you could not do inside the United States, you will look basically to look at within the Americas, and obviously you need also our countries to take the initiative to tell to the United States what we could do in the private sector, as I said, in technology, in critical minerals, in nuclear energy, in trade and investment, and particularly also in fishing in the Atlantic and in Antarctica. So it's America first and the Americas second, and for that, you need America and Latin America to focus on where the common interests are.
Thank you. Sylvia.
So building on that, yes, I think we all know that we are moving towards regionalization as opposed to internationalization.
Exactly.
And that the hemisphere of the Americas, North America, Latin America, Caribbean, et cetera, have all of the resources and all of the potential to be an economic powerhouse. From, of course, our natural resources, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, to our human capacity, to our companies. But I think you touched on it. To get our own companies, i.e. Canadian, American companies of the region, to invest and believe in the region, you need to have strong institutions. You need to have the respect for the rule of law. You need to have a common vision for protecting labor rights, paying them appropriately, protecting the environment. And I think that's where the issue is. Essentially, it's not a level playing field. And so if you're a corporation looking to invest and grow your company, where are you going to be putting that money? Given some of the risks that are inherent in the region, and including, of course, political instability. And so these are important factors, but I do believe it is an era for the Americas, and it's our time, I think, to step up to the plate and work collectively and cooperatively to reach our own goals. And if I may, just talking about the USMCA again, we've proven that when we work together, it does benefit all countries. So the 3 countries that are part of that agreement, Canada, Mexico, and US, which was renegotiated under Trump 1.0, all 3 economies have grown substantially since the renewed framework. We've all benefited in terms of economic prosperity. And I think that's something we want to see for the Americas. I don't know if a free trade agreement of the Americas is back in terms of a vision statement, but that's certainly something we are plugging away at as Canada. So we have bilateral agreements with many countries of the region. We've tried negotiating with Mercosur. That's a longer process with Mercosur, of course, but I think they've now concluded with Europe. So there you go. There's hope. There's hope for other countries. And I just wanted to say, because I haven't heard it spoken yet today, and maybe I missed some of the previous speakers, I think your point is a good one about how do you attract investment in a way that helps development. And countries reach sustainable development goals. And I think the retrenchment of USAID is going to be a huge impediment to achieving those goals because the programming under the international assistance envelope is to help with governance, with strengthening of institutions, with strengthening rule of law. And so the retrenchment is going to cause a big vacuum that might provide opportunity, again, for others, i.e. perhaps the topic of the day, China, to fill a gap. No one country is big enough to replace and fill the gap being left by the departure of USAID. And I think that's a huge, how should I say, well, it's a big problem, obviously.
A vulnerability in the region.
Pardon me?
It's a vulnerability.
A vulnerability, that is what I wanted to say. Thank you for the word. But I also wanted to pick up on the fact that there is a lot of money to support projects in the region. The IFIs are very present. We have the Caribbean Development Bank, of course, in the Caribbean, World Bank, IADB. In the case of Canada, big pension funds, big and well-endowed pension funds that have trillions of dollars that they're looking to invest. But the issues of endemic, perhaps corruption and political change, makes these investments or investors a bit nervous, and these are things we need to address.
Very, very comprehensible. Allow me to integrate Mr. Gerard with a question about vulnerabilities when it comes to investing in Latin America and the Caribbean specifically. So what are the biggest risks to economic security facing Caribbean nations today, from the climate shocks to the capital dependence, and how can innovative financing mechanisms help mitigate these vulnerabilities? So we were talking about vulnerabilities as well.
Sure. I think it's very important to understand why perhaps I'm sitting here today. Obviously, one medium-sized country in Latin America has a far bigger economy, far bigger population than the entire English-speaking Caribbean combined. And obviously, it's because of location. So it's where the Caribbean happens to be, which is sometimes referred to as the third border of the United States. And so it's a very complicated little place. I mean, often you see the names of the countries don't fit inside the country, so you have to write in the ocean the name of the country. And you're talking about countries of 100,000 people. I think, well, if you think of the population of St. Kitts, Nevis, which is a country, sovereign country, its population is smaller than the student body of this university. So I think what's very important is that the policies for Latin America and the Caribbean, which often when I was at the IDB, they would say that LAC really is Latin American countries, because it's very hard to remember these tiny little countries. So the reality is these are incredibly open economies, small and narrow, very few products. 75% of the GDP is traded. In other words, globalization is not an option. It's a fact of life. And many things, you talk about a Caribbean, a chicken, for example, that's grown in Jamaica, 80% of that chicken, although it's born and grows up and is killed and then eaten in that country, over 80% of it is imported. The eggs, the house it lives in, the food it eats, the knife that kills it, the truck that drives it to the market, the fridge that it sits in. So I think it's very important, I know that this is a small part of this conference, that the policies obviously have to be tailor-made. You can't really have a policy for LAC if the C really means the Caribbean. That said, I think you mentioned the multilaterals. I think, well, the ambassador mentioned the CDB. And there's the World Bank, there's the IDB, there are bilateral programs from the European Union, from Canada. At the end of the day, I think the final comment about the pension funds is the important one. The savings that the Caribbean uses other people's savings or tries to access other people's savings. The development banks have been pushed back by the Chinese financing. Why? When a country is in trouble, the Chinese financing goes towards the country. When a little country is in trouble, commercial financing doesn't go towards it. I mean, it would be silly to do that. Insurance, as you know, like the forest fires in California, mean that the cost of insurance for the Caribbean, which is very vulnerable to hurricanes, the cost goes up, or the access goes away. They just simply don't offer it, the reinsurers. So that's a very important thing, that if you're going to talk about combating or in some way competing with the Chinese influence, that policy of going towards little troubled countries, the current arrangements with the multilateral banks like the World Bank, IDB, is not to increase exposure to little countries in trouble.
Yeah. So let me ask you then, how can smaller economies in the Caribbean region strengthen their integration into global supply chains without compromising local resilience or development priorities?
Answered the question. Okay, got it. Well, what is definitely the message that's been received is this sense of entitlement, or that somebody owes a solution. I think there's a maturity that has happened and is happening in the Caribbean to solving its own problems. And first of all, you have to have buffers. If you're going to survive, and so globalization, as I said earlier, I was trying to answer by saying that it's not really a policy decision. When 75% of your GDP is traded, you're open. Your existence means that your economy is open. So the question is, how do you survive? How do you make investments so the terms of trade, in other words, your ability to earn, is increased? The only way is to increase productivity, and that's private sector investment. That hasn't been happening. Productivity in the region has been falling. Competitiveness is stagnant or falling. So the only way around that, to survive extreme weather events, the only way to compete and to be the digital divide, if you're on the wrong side of it, as a small place, then you're condemned for decades to come to poverty, which I don't think the US wants. Unstable, non-growing, increasingly poor countries on its third border. But the solutions are not, you talked about innovative financing mechanisms saving the day. So what have we got? We've got an insurance product for the region which covers a tiny percentage of the risk. You've got multilateral banks and commercial banks that run away from problems, which they should. You've got over-indebted countries. You've got now hurricane clauses that, so if countries in the Caribbean borrow and there's a hurricane, they get to delay repayments, but they don't go away. And also, if you're a country that wants to grow, you cannot be basing your growth on restructuring your debt. Or say, well, I can't pay it. Well, that's not a very good solution, because who's going to lend to you tomorrow? And also, I can't pay my debt doesn't mean, well, if you don't have access to finance, which you need to grow, you're not going to grow. So I don't put a lot of hope in the current. They're great and they're wonderful. Please do them. In terms of the very important one is the Paris Club. So when countries get into trouble, most recently, the most heavily indebted country in the world to China on a per capita, on a GDP basis, Suriname. When Suriname got into trouble recently and it needed the Paris Club, it didn't work. So the IMF is trying to come up. Why? Because China is not sitting in the Paris Club. It just simply didn't participate on the same terms. You can't have one set of creditors. I think Argentina has taught us. You can't have one set of creditors agreeing to one solution, but another set getting better terms. So I think that the international machinery for solving problems of when things go wrong it's not working very well. I think most people acknowledge that. And one of the key areas where that was demonstrated recently was in Suriname. It definitely needs to be fixed. And so the holdouts, when China holds out for different terms, that doesn't work for the Caribbean or anybody.
Let's talk about solutions now, because we're kind of running out of time. Martin, you wanted to offer solutions to the set of problems that we're facing.
Yeah. First is, what kind of approach should Latin America and the US have? Should the US try to compete with China in terms of resources? Should it try to contain China? I don't think both strategies could work, and also could Latin American countries do sort of bandwagoning. I don't think that would have, it's very cold in here, that I would have the support of our populations. What I have come out after doing a lot of research during this year is that the key concept where there is common interest between Latin America and the United States and Canada is selective engagement. And by selective engagement, I mean to have where are the threats to national security of the United States in the Americas, where there should be red flags there if we want each country to have, you know, a stronger bilateral relationship with the US. For example, in the case of new ports that could be built in the region, that should be a red flag that should be put by the United States to the country in question. Of course, there should be alternatives. What kind of alternatives you have for development. But I think those red flags could be basically all of the threats in terms of immigration, in terms of potential conflicts, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of basically supply chains. You know, those are the threats to national security, where I think that selective engagement should be between Latin America and the US. And then for the rest, let's leave the countries, if we get out of those issues that are red flags for national security in the United States, well, leave each country to do whatever strategy they need to take in order to develop their own countries. Now, I would also like to point out, so first, the concept of selective engagement. Second, the issue of, we have talked about trade, but another critical element is how do we build, or how do we construct new investment protection agreements of the next generation, of the cutting edge generation. And by investment protection agreement is bilateral agreements that we can get across the region to provide American companies, Canadian companies, the rule of law, the supranational capacity that if there is a conflict in terms of the exchange rate, in terms of any potential legal litigation, that there could be a source of resolution that could be outside of the courts of our country. So that could give, so investment protection of last generation should be, for example, in critical minerals. I would really like to see our countries moving in bilateral agreements of critical minerals where we provide the security that US or Canadian company needs, and we also get in return the investment to develop value-added chain, to develop, for example, batteries, steel batteries for houses or for factories. You know, you develop employment within the region. So that kind of trade-off. Last but not least is focus by American financial institutions. We just mentioned USAID. In this research that I've done during this year, I've seen that USAID has invested or spent, whatever you see this way, in the region $1.8 billion. 450 million has been used in cultural events. Part of that, I would say, in a magazine in Argentina called Amphibia. I don't even know what that magazine is. And to be honest, I found it through my research. So, you know, what is the focus of aid in the US, but also the focus, and I will go to my principal job in the financial world, to the IDB and to the Development Finance Corporation. Those are the two key institutions. As you know, the US has 30% of the voting power at the IDB and has a total control of the Development Finance Corporation. Well, they have been financing everything from environment, which is very important, labor regulations. I will say focus. Social programs are very important in our countries, but it should be financed with our own budgets. Okay, but basically what you need from these developmental institutions is to focus in infrastructure, in how to integrate more the Americas. So physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, cybersecurity, those are the areas where the US should use its leverage to counterbalance the financial arm that basically China has put into Latin America. So selective engagement, investment protection agreements of last generation, and basically focus of the, always resources by definition are scarce, so focus the muscle, the financial muscle that the US has in these areas that I have mentioned, again, critical minerals, nuclear energy, fisheries, infrastructure, and basically supply chain, focus in how to finance them, in how to integrate better the Americas. That will create a win-win situation to defend the national security of the United States in the region, and also to provide a developmental agenda, an economic developmental agenda for the region.
Fantastic. Solutions, Sylvia.
I'd like piggybacking on your responses because Canada's approach is similar to the recommendations. We have very much a multi-pronged approach to our engagement in the region. Firstly, let's start with security and defense. So we have a lot of operations, both bilaterally and with the US, and multilaterally with our armed forces personnel. To look at some of the illicit activity, to address the illicit activity that's happening in the waters of the hemisphere, right? So illegal movement of drugs, money, guns, and of course, migrants. We also train a lot of the military personnel from the region through a military training cooperation program. We have, including here in Miami, partners from security-based departments. So the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the equivalent of the Border Patrol here, which is CBS, Canadian Border Services Agency, Immigration Refugee personnel embedded here and across the region to share intelligence with counterparts and do joint operations. So that's all the security and defense. We're very engaged economically. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 7 free trade agreements in the region. So with the bigger economies, Mexico, I'm going to name them all. Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, which is the Pacific Alliance countries, but also with Panama, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and on and off negotiations with Mercosur. That's the next big one. Our trade in the region has increased 58% over the last 5 years. We have 39 billion bilateral trade. It might sound like a big number, but truthfully, it's less than 5% of Canada's international trade, so there's definitely room to do more. As I mentioned earlier, 50% of Canada's overseas mining assets are in the region. I found the number, it's 102 billion in investment stock, including in Argentina and Chile. We're working a lot with our companies to introduce that supply chain resiliency, and we're looking at more of that nearshoring and friendshoring. We have robust international assistance programming, 1.2 billion per year, so a lot smaller than USAID. It's about 10% of our total envelope is spent in the region. But conversely to USAID, we don't do any cultural programming. We're very much focused on addressing migration, climate change, and inclusive growth. And I should say that we are a very big presence in Haiti after the US. So there was the comment about donor fatigue earlier. That is true. After Canada and the US, contributions to addressing what's happening in Haiti drop off precipitously. Haiti is the country that receives the 3rd largest amount from Canada in the world, and that's after Ukraine and Somalia. That's how invested we are in securing the region and addressing, of course, what's happening right here at home. We have a lot of anti-crime and capacity building programming I've touched on a little bit. We also do a program on weapons threat reduction, women, peace, and security. So we are working many, many angles to address some of the critical challenges that we see in the hemisphere. And we do so bilaterally, but we do so a lot as well, and we haven't mentioned them yet, but the Organization of American States, the OAS, it does a lot of programming in the region. We do so with CARICOM, our CARICOM neighbors, and mostly bilaterally with the US and multilaterally through UN agencies. And I completely take the point. I mentioned free trade agreements, but FIPAs, so foreign investment protection agreements, are of course also critical, which are much more extensive. I think we have them with almost all countries of the region. So it's one thing to have the agreement, the other is that they be respected and that there be a mechanism if there are disputes. Dispute resolution mechanisms or even compensation, as is the case of a very big mining project, $6 billion copper mine in Panama that was recently, anyway, I wouldn't say expropriated, but they're not negotiating. That is not good for the region when things like that happen. You need to respect the agreements, the investments, and have mechanisms, to your point, if there are disputes. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. Gerard, would you like to add something else before we open up the panel for questions?
Just very quickly, in terms of solutions, as you said, although it's not the primary topic, I represented the IDB program in Haiti for 4 years in Port-au-Prince, and the comment was made earlier about whether or not the intervention is working, and if the intervention is measured by foreign boots on the ground, whether it's technical or security, and that they're less now than before. I have to say I agree with the comment of the second, from the last panel, that foreign intervention and foreign boots on the ground will never be the solution in Haiti. Unless there's a government, unless there's a local government with its own boots on its own ground, I don't think solutions should be measured by the number of foreigners who happen to be there at any point in time. And just in terms of solutions for the Caribbean, travel advisories from the North American, where the tourists come from, it would be helpful if they were more sensitive to actual conditions on the ground. These are democratic countries where the rule of law applies, and there's hardly any incidents of tourists being attacked, if at all. And when there's an improvement in reducing crime, hopefully these travel advisory can be more sensitive to the reality on the ground. As a matter of fact, we're looking more to Latin America, to Brazil, Argentina, other countries in South America for tourism, because I think they're a little bit more resilient when it comes to or aware when it's to really assessing risk to tourists coming. So that would help a lot. In terms of insurance, what the Florida government faced was households, businesses losing access to insurance, which obviously your economy cannot work without insurance. It would be really interesting to help share that experience with the Caribbean, because it's facing the same reality, but doesn't have the financial ability to do what Florida did, which was, I think, a leadership role there. And lastly, I would say in terms of attracting private sector investment, it's very hard for the private sector to be attracted to tiny places without economies of scale and small markets. So, but the Chinese investment is willing to do it. So it'd be great to hear some ideas of how that can be bridged. But the only way to do it is to have some sort of incentive for private firms to invest in the Caribbean, because the markets aren't big enough on its own for private sector decisions to ever take the investment there. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions from the panel? Yes, right there.
Hello. Hi again. My name is Armando, master student for cybersecurity and tech policy. My question is, given the increasing geopolitical interest in the Arctic Ocean, particularly as melting ice opens new shipping routes and resource access, how do Canada and hemispheric partners in Latin America view the strategic and environmental implications of the Arctic developments, and what role can inter-American cooperation play in shaping security and governance in that region? Thank you.
Who would you like the person to answer?
I can start.
Sylvia?
Thank you for your question. We've spoken a lot about LAC, and I think he's asking us to talk about the Arctic now. And thank you for the question. In fact, Canada is very, very, very seized with the geopolitical issues that we see around the globe being played out in the Arctic. We are, of course, a country of the Arctic. And we recently, the previous government recently unveiled our Arctic policy, which kind of reflects the fact that we need to be more present and we need to be protecting our continental shelf that extends into the Arctic, because it is kind of the next frontier where we do see the geopolitical tension playing out, including, of course, with Russia and China, and the proximity that that means in terms of our hemispheric security if they increase their presence there. So Canada's, I forget what all the elements of the policy are, but are to be there more present in terms of our military and with icebreaking vessels, with a diplomatic presence, and doing more within the Arctic Council to protect our sovereignty, actually, in the Arctic waters.
Would you like to answer that? No? We're good. Next question.
Good morning. My name is Wolf Buffield, Executive Director of Haiti Policy House. So I have two questions, one for Gerard and for the Consul General, Sylvia. I will start with the Consul General. So recently the U.S. Designated the Haitian gangs as terrorist organizations. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, recently the U.S. designated the Haitian gangs as terrorist organizations. As far as Canada perspective, I think the response has been mixed so far from the U.S. because there are side out saying that the designation will impact local humanitarian assistance. And as far as Canada is concerned, will it take a similar step forward, or is it going to recalibrate the response or review the response and then move differently? And then the second question is for Gerard. How do you see the Caribbean Single Market Economy Initiative going with CARICOM, and how will it pivot given the current U.S. administration view on trade?
Well, thank you for your question. Perhaps I'll start on the Haiti question. I think it's been a policy, Canadian and U.S. foreign policy priority to address the situation in Haiti, and absolutely take the point, and that's very much Canada's position, that any solution to what's happening in the country has to come from within, which is why we've supported the transnational government that's been put in place. We're providing support for those discussions. We're providing a lot of financial support to the security mission that's there. We're also providing training to the Haitian National Police, both in country and outside of the country. Where the U.S. is going on the policy vis-a-vis Haiti, I don't quite know. Whether that means it will impact Canadian policy also remains to be seen. One thing for sure is that after the U.S., Canada has the largest Haitian diaspora community, and that we would be watching closely what U.S.'s policy is, especially if that meant an increase of irregular migration of Haitians from the U.S. into Canada, which in fact we're already starting to see a little bit, in particular here from Miami. The other tool we have, which I didn't mention earlier but is also pertinent to Haiti, is sanctions. So we do use a lot of sanctioning of individuals, so not economic sanctions on countries as a whole, but for instance in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti, where we're sanctioning individuals that we feel are playing an unhelpful role, say, when it comes to human rights and democracy, and potentially, and of course, in the case of Haiti, many of the gang leaders. So not sure whether we'll name them as terrorist organizations, but we'll watch that space. Thank you.
And Mr. Gerard?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the question. In terms, the CARICOM is the political grouping of the English-speaking Caribbean countries. Haiti is also a member. The Dominican Republic is an observer. And so, in terms of the policy of that grouping, it's an outward-looking group. So, although it's attempting to look like a common market, the truth is the trade inside the Caribbean is very limited. It's really, as you said, the relationship with the United States is the important one. To the extent that a tariff increase would have to be, the extent to which a tariff increase is absorbed by the Caribbean, in other words, that the cost of the tariff is not passed on to the American consumers, which in each case that has to be estimated. It's not even for all the countries or all the products. Very important that tourism, not be affected by that. Obviously, increase of 10% in the cost to tourists would hurt demand. These are very vulnerable countries, and any shock, like a sudden increase in the cost of what it exports to the United States, would be detrimental to the economies. Remember, these are economies that run a deficit with the U.S. They import a lot more from the U.S. than they export. So I'm hopeful that that will be taken into account, that there's really no economic reason, there's no surplus being run except for one country, which is Guyana, where the Exxon, which is a U.S. company, is producing the petroleum that's exported. So in terms of a common position, I think obviously the position would be to seek some understanding with the U.S. of the dire impact that policy could have.
Can I make a final comment? 2 seconds?
We ran out of time. I did a horrible job as a timekeeper. So we'll have to.
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
10 seconds or me van a ahorcar.
There is an opportunity between Latin America and the US if Latin America is able to understand the national security concerns that the US has in the region, and if the US is capable of understanding the developmental needs that our region has.
Beautiful.
Well said.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Excellent
you.
questions.
Horrible.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and what a great morning. Now we're going to move to our lunch time. Our lunch is going to be in the faculty club. You just exit and make a left, and it'll be the final room to the left. We're going to return at 1:15, okay? 1:15, and we'll go to start with our breakout sessions, okay? So see you all back here at 1:15.